Hi, so welcome back, everybody, to the new episode of the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. And today we have Dr. Sam Cox from the philosophical department to talk about Chinese philosophies. So welcome joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here, Sung.
That's
Thanks.
great. Yeah. So just to give you guys a heads up, Sam is an expert in Eastern philosophy, specializing in Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy. So since I'm from China, I probably want to start with something I can understand from the first. And then after this one, maybe we will shoot another episode on Indian philosophies. I definitely want to know all there are in Eastern philosophies. So, but today we will be focusing on Chinese philosophy. So if I could, I want to start with the first question. I actually got this list from like anybody who is studying philosophies, but we want to run it on Chinese philosophy. So let's talk about ontologies. What are Chinese philosophers view? Like, where do we come from, and what's the purpose of the life?
Right. So the basic Chinese kind of ontology or their theory of existence, the one reason why I think that that's a really good question to begin with is because even though there's a wide variety of different Chinese philosophies, right? You know what I mean? It spins out into all these different directions. In many ways, there's like a kind of common appreciation for this basic way of understanding the world, right? Like their basic worldview, you might want to say. And, you know, one way that I would put this, and I'm going to try and kind of synthesize at least a bunch of different stuff that really informs my way of thinking. There's a classic text called, is translated as something like the Book of Changes, right? And in this book, you kind of have this idea of this material physical cosmos, right? That's engaged in this ceaseless activity of creation and productivity, right? Kind of pulsating, you know? And I think a better word for it would be something like cyclical sometimes, you know, so it kind of goes in cycles. And while there's a lot of debate about this, and this is where it's almost overwhelming, like one could spend one's life just focusing on this one question. There's a lot of debate on whether or not there's a true beginning, you know what I mean? Or it's just always been here, producing, creating, going through all these different kind of cycles and stages. So as they say, kind of, you know, arising, then returning, you know. And so there's an interesting tension in their ontology. And then I'll stop for a second because I think I'm at a good pause point. So this would be the true lesson for me, right? Is remembering that I'm in a conversation here and not just, you know, engaged in a 3-hour lecture. But the interesting tension there is on one hand, there's this emphasis on material reality as something that can flourish, right? That can be healthy, and that humans can help with that. While also recognizing that, like I said, there's these cycles. So things get better, they get worse, they get better, they get worse, right? You know, and that's kind of like an understanding of things. But the basic material of reality for the Chinese is something called qi, right? And qi is translated as like material force, physical energy. And so everything, me, you, the plants, the rocks, is some kind of qi, you know? And so everything in the Chinese worldview, everything is interacting, influencing, and is able to enhance or contribute to everything else. So it's this really dynamic worldview. Yeah, so I don't know if that's a good start or not, you know?
That's great. Yeah. So if I try to reflect on what I know, not from a philosophical point of view, but my understanding of my culture is the part you talk about, the material world. That means there is certainly a human part of it. That is, human can work hard and try to change the world, change the society, bringing good politics and economics. But meanwhile, since the country has been there for so long, we totally understand that the nature is actually the dominant force. No matter what you want it, you don't want it, it's gonna come.
That's right.
When you become exactly positive, you're at the peak, prepare to go low. And when you're at the low, you know, okay, when it's lowest, it's not gonna go back. So it's almost like a balance is right in the middle, but it will kind of go up and down, up and down. And that is basically our understanding of what usually people call Tao. We don't have a beginning. Tao exists before the world was created.
Yeah.
It's always there, right? That's where you say, like, there's not a beginning of a world. It's actually everything in the world, behaves according
Yeah.
to the law set up by
Yeah.
Tao. That
Right.
makes sense to me.
Or-
And probably that will generate to
Yeah.
our ideas of life. For example, like cycling of life. It's like we believe in
Yes.
afterlife, and you do something. So that's why we watch so much about what we do right now. You do good, your
Right.
next life you become a good person, a rich person, a pretty person. And if you do bad, you
Yes.
become not even a person. You're going to have a miserable life if you're a person, or you're going to become a pig eaten by other people.
Right.
You're going to become like a
Right.
crab smashed by other people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
Yeah.
resonancing here for my understanding of our view of the world.
See, this is really good for me to hear, right? You know what I mean? Because at any point, if what I'm saying isn't going to resonate with somebody who was raised, and is familiar with that culture, then I'm doing something wrong, right? Yeah, I want to react to something you said really quick though, that really resonated with me. Is this? I really like how you put it, that what's going to happen is going to happen, right? So this notion of fate, right? Ming, and what the Neo-Confucians, so this comes in like Song and Ming, later China, or modern, or whatever, but post medieval China, right? That Tian Li, right? So the principle of heaven, right? And so yeah, we're not fully in charge, right? We're not fully in charge. That's right, and there's something about that humility, right? That kind of humbleness.
Yeah, it's in our society. Basically, we think the empire, which has been there for all the time, is kind of
Yeah.
like we call it the son of the Tian Li. So he's basically the son of the law.
Yeah. Right.
But we also reserve the right. Is just the sun, the sky is watching. The Tian Li, the heaven is watching, and see, hey, I give you a job.
Yes.
And I watched with all the people here, and you're not doing a job to keep doing a good job to keep them fed, keep them educated, keep them happy.
Yeah.
So now they
Right.
have all the right. So I'm going to authorize another person to come here to replace you. And that's usually how we start a rebellion. We always say, hey, I had a dream last night. And heaven point to me and say, hey, the empire is now doing the right thing. And you have all my authority to go and overthrow him and become the next generation. So that's why you can see, kind of my guess is why there are so many dynasties in China. And between dynasties, they don't have any blood relationship. It's almost like, yeah, anybody with any family name can come here and conquer, as long as you're here for the benefit of the people and you have the authority from the sky.
Right. There's something very powerful about that, right? I mean, it reminds me of a paper I read. 15 years ago, really great paper about like how Confucian philosophy can be used to kind of legitimize, right, this kind of like uprising, right? And if the situation is right, if that's what heaven decrees, right? And so what the Hunza, the exemplary person, right, is able to tell, right, when things are ready, right?
It's amazing. We follow that thing for almost like 2,000 years now. It's still the same philosophy, same mindset. It's just like, if you are the guy who's in charge, you have a job to do.
Yeah.
You're rich, you're fed simply because you need to do this job right.
Right.
And your authority comes from, we always reserve the right as the citizens, let's say, or people, reserve the right to actually overthrow your throne. If we're not happy, we're going to change you. That's basically our philosophy. Like, that's why we put you in charge, because we always have the right to just, get rid of you.
Yeah.
So don't piss us off. That's basically the philosophy behind that. You definitely have heard about this metaphor before. That is like, people or the people of the country is like water.
Yeah.
Right. They can lift your boat. They can overthrow your boat. So when you try to sail on that as a pilot, don't get too much of yourself.
That's right.
Okay. It's all about the water.
Yeah. And there's such a concern about this, right? Just focusing specifically on the leader, right, the ruler, or in their role, right? So and of course the emphasis upon role, right? And like one of your questions was about family, the significance of family and so forth. And where was I kind of going with this? But whatever. I was jumping ahead to another question. I'm gonna show some restraint.
Good. Yeah. Another comment I want to make is just when you talk about qi.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because it's almost like an energy, and qi can be anything. That is, I can be a mixture of qi right now in a certain kind of form, but when I die, I become the nature. And part of my qi will become an animal, part of my qi will become a rock, part of my qi will become a plant. in those kind of way in
Yeah.
Tao, you kind of go easier on life. You never feel like
Mhm.
people are really forever gone because conservation of energy, right?
That's right.
Like you
That's
don't
right.
create it, you don't get rid of energies.
And that's absolutely true. That's really just, that's the mindset, right? You know, and to me, that's mind blowing, right? That's just kind of like a natural way of thinking, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
For,
yeah,
for an average kind of citizen of that culture. And to go on that, I something else, because I'm working on a paper right now that concerns some of these issues, but so the chi of our ancestors, right? Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
And, and the importance of maintaining the health, right? The what you might, what a biologist might call the ecosystem function, right? Like the importance of maintaining the health of the environment, because the environment continues to mingle, right, with the chi of our ancestors, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And it's just so the different, all these different levels of integration and connection, right? When we're talking about physical reality, right? And so
that's
forth.
really interesting. In our
Yeah,
mythology, actually, we believe anything can become eventually a god. Like
yeah,
even you're a plant, but you just have
right.
been there for long enough. Like after 5,000 years, somehow the plant can speak.
Yeah, yeah,
And
right.
if the plant just keep doing good, they can become
Yeah,
actually they can transform into a human shape of things, but they're still a plant.
that
But it's
is,
an illusion. They can become a human, and then they actually do good things. They treat people well. They help people, and eventually they can become God.
right,
So
right.
we believe in a spirit everywhere. That's why you don't want to mess up with anything, like even a
Yeah,
rock,
yeah, yeah.
right? Even if for
That's
plant,
right.
try to be humble. Try to make sure you don't piss off anybody around you, even the building or
That's
even
right.
the
That's
you know
right.
the plants
I like.
around you. Yeah,
I kind of like this notion of not pissing off. Like I appreciate that, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because there's this kind of potential for divinity, right?
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? There's this potential for divinity and everything. Thanks for sharing that with me.
yeah.
Because there's this way of talking about, what is it, the word li, like, and not ritual, but the later the when it's translated as principle or like pattern. Um, but this idea that there's like this depth to things, right? Um, in regards to what they can be, you know, and so that kind of demands that we respect it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That
that's kind of
that's
our
pretty
mindset.
intense. I like that.
Yeah, that's kind of our
Yeah,
mindset. Is just like if you keep working hard, in whichever way, eventually you got the reward. So there's no people who are born to be a god. They become a god
yeah,
simply because they did so many good. That's why they become a god.
yeah,
And if you do the same thing, if people worship you, and it's actually very real. Is a lot of Chinese historical figures after they die, they become a god in the myth.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Right?
mm-hmm.
It's like Guan Yu and even Confucius. Like when
Oh
he
yes,
died, people think he become a god and he's watching over us from now
yeah,
on. And the
right,
same thing
right.
applies to our family. That is probably the worst thing you can do to a Chinese family is try to go there and dig out their tomb,
Oh,
their ancestors'
right.
bones, and humiliate them. Right. So that's the worst thing you can do. And even for feng shui, a lot of people knows about feng shui here. They think it's
Yeah,
just how you actually want to arrange your house, for example, into a
right,
certain direction to
right.
get everything. But feng shui actually directly come from how do you use the resource from the nature
Yeah,
to
right.
actually give you a bless, and that include a lot of where do you want to put the tomb of your ancestors or your families.
Yeah, right.
So it's very important for Chinese people.
Mm.
Another thing I want to point out here is you mentioned qi, right?
Yes, yes.
Another interesting thing Chinese people do is we think everybody is a combination of three things: the positive, the masculinity, which is
Mm-hmm,
yang,
mm-hmm,
and the
mm-hmm.
yin, which is more like the negative, the shallow, the dark one, and the bright one and the dark one, the masculinity and the femininity. And but there's a third thing which is called he, which is kind of like the percentage, if I can say
Yeah,
it. Right.
right, right, right.
So everybody has this, and we kind of want to say, hey, you want to stay in the middle with he because you have your aggression, you have
Mm-hmm,
your
mm-hmm,
sympathy, and you
mm-hmm.
somehow want to put justice and mercy into the same body.
Yeah.
The key to a good life is actually try to find a balance between these two. And
Mm-hmm,
if you're
mm-hmm.
leaning towards either way, you're kind of like demonized, or like you're not right in the right balance, and eventually you will pay for that because you disturb the balance.
Yeah. Yeah, is that word translated as harmony or balance? Is that?
Yeah, partly.
Is
Yeah,
that right?
partly.
Okay. Yeah. That's fantastic. That's great. Well, and the need for this kind of polarity, right? The need for these opposites too, or radical differences. Um, and it's interesting too. For I mean, like I mean, now I have a student who took Asian philosophy with me about a year ago, and we really got into like this notion of how opposites and the kind of harmony or balance between them, how seriously that's taken, right? And an appreciation of that as being like a very real kind of aspect of reality. And she's in my environmental ethics class right now, and she's very disappointed. You'll appreciate this greatly. She's very disappointed in how many Western kind of theories seem to want to focus. They just want to focus on this one extreme, right?
Yep.
Rather than, I mean, Aristotle, as you know, is a difference, right? I mean, that's the exception because he sees this issue about balance, right? But
between animal and human, yeah.
yeah, but it's
Human
just
and God.
it's neat to see a student react that way. She was so taken, right, with this kind of Chinese ontology, this way of thinking about material reality, that she's become kind of like a critic, right, of all these Western film. It's lovely, it's delightful, right? We have a good time with it, but she's like, there's no appreciation of the tension, and the balance between these opposites. And I said, I understand.
I think the key idea behind that is, if you go at the peak for too long of the time,
Yeah.
you are going to fall. You overuse your power.
Mm-hmm.
You got exhausted. And when you are at low for too many times, you got to turn back. Otherwise, you're wasting your life, you're wasting your energy, and you may die because of doing that. So it's almost like, do your work, but take a break, take a rest.
Mm-hmm.
Try to recollect everything you have to make sure you're prepared for the next thing which is coming. I think that is kind of like what's essential about Tao.
I agree. Yeah. Passivity and activity, right? Yeah.
That will actually also change if you think about it, like how Chinese people do stuff is like just like when I was young, right? I was a big fan of Confucius. I believe like even though something is not doable, but it's the right thing, you should do it.
Yes. Yeah.
But as I get older, I leaning more towards Tao and learning more about it. I found this is beautiful. It's just like if you want to get anything done, the first thing you do is not doing anything, but watch and see if it's the right time, and see if you have the right resource and right people. And if you don't have those kind of things, you're just blindly doing what you're doing. You're harming everybody.
Right.
So wait for the thing to be ripe for you to actually start. Wait for the opportunities.
Yeah. That's an astute remark you make, because I think that's an aspect in Taoist philosophy. It's one of the richest, most interesting aspects in Taoist philosophy is how it leads to kind of like a cultivation of awareness, right? And kind of broadens our perceptual, right, capacities, right? Makes us more receptive to detail, right? And whether or not something is going to actually contribute, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or somehow gonna make things worse, I think that's and to be able to be that kind of person. Another really beautiful thing about Taoism, as you know, right, is you can't have all that clutter, right? You know what I mean? You've just got to kind of calm the mind down a little bit to have that broad, open, expansive view,
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you think about
I think they're right too, but I mean, that's just me. I think they're right.
If you think about it, like most of our conflict in our mental world comes from when the world in our perception contradicts with the real world.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Then you start to wonder, why don't the real world acting my way?
Yeah.
I'm not happy. I want to change the world. But Tao is exactly opposite. That is like the world has been there before you came. The world will be here after you're gone.
Yeah.
So maybe change your way and start to think not in your mind, but think from nature's perspective. Yeah. Not even in humans' perspective. Think about it in rocks, in birds. Think about things in plants. And then you figure out, wow, this is so natural. Right. I really like a metaphor that he used is just like, he talked about Xi Shi, which is like it's like Helen, one of the most beautiful ladies back in ancient China.
Right.
Yeah, he talked about like he walks to the river, and then when the fish sees her, the fish just run away. And when the bird sees him, the birds just fly away. Why? Because they're scared.
Mm.
You're such a beautiful lady, but why are they scared? Because they don't understand human beauty. So who's beautiful? Who's not beautiful? Who are human to judge what's beautiful and what's not beautiful?
That's right.
And once you start to see things in nature's way, you kind of start to appreciate the beauty. It's just like, yeah, a green grass is better than a blue grass. A blue grass is better than a yellow grass. And summer is better than winter.
Yeah.
But really, like, who are you to judge which is better? You start to appreciate the winter, the beauty of the winter. You start to appreciate the beauty of the death and everything, right?
Yeah. Right. That's right. There's Zhuangzi, right? Great text. And so this idea of getting to the point where we refrain from or transcend making distinctions, right? Good, bad, right? Beautiful, ugly. We kind of move past that and just kind of affirm, right? Just kind of say yes to everything. Yeah, there's this really, there's something really beautiful also about how there's a real respect, I guess that's the word, or appreciation for everything as it is, right? Do you know what I mean? And it's individuality, right? Do you know what I mean? Or as a particular, right? Like you said, this rock, right? It's not even rocks, right? It's this rock, right? This person, this flower, right? Yeah, it's like it's radical, right? I mean, there's no attempt to project anything onto the world at all, right? Which you do find in many ways. I mean, and that's where some of the, and I'll just say something really quick, and that's where things get to be kind of interesting, and that's where you see some of these like tensions within Chinese philosophy itself, right? Because by the time you get to like Neo-Confucianism, so Juxi and like 16th century like Wang Yangming,
yep,
nature, right? Like Confucianism is all the way down on the rocks, right? Do you know what I mean? So like rocks are my brothers and sisters, right? Do you know what I mean? So that family, that Confucian family model is extended to everything. Everything is one big family, And there's something kind of beautiful about that too. But that's very different from Taoism, right? Which I think is much more radical, right? Like there's a much more of like, you're not my brother, you're not my sister, but you're still there, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's interesting because eventually what you're trying to battle is just nihilism, right? It's just like nothing's important. What's the point of life? There's no point of life.
Yeah.
There's no eternity or anything. So Tao kind of denied everything. Just like nothing is worth doing if you just start to put a value on it. But once you stop doing that, what's left? What's left is Tao. And then starting from there, you start to see Tao everywhere. And you find actually, if you empty what you have, now Tao can actually finally come in. Before you're just so full of yourself. So you're like a full cup. So Tao cannot just touch you. But once you empty your cup, get rid of everything, then Tao comes in, and then that's when you deny everything, you start to actually appreciate the beauty because you basically accept everything.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and probably the ultimate purpose of doing this is just eventually you can be as close to Tao as possible.
Right.
And it's almost like you can achieve eternity in that way.
Right.
Otherwise, what's the point of life? So Confucius was still trying to put a value on what's right, what's wrong. And his whole book is telling you like what it means to be a good person.
Yes.
A good king.
Yeah.
A good father, a good son, and everything. It's more about ethics, but Tao is beyond that.
I think so too. No doubt about it. And I think that with Tao, we also see that. I think an objection to Confucianism is that they would argue that Confucianism is too forced, right? It's like forcing one's will or way onto things, right? In that sense.
Yeah. But the problem with Tao is that can be only an individual thing. You cannot even form a nation with Tao.
No, no, it's
You would
hard.
prefer
Yeah,
everybody to stay disconnected, right? The
oh
moment you put
wait,
people together, they
there you
compare
go.
each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got good or bad, then don't do that. So everybody live isolated. So that's just an ideal situation. But for Confucius, that's more like the real world thing. It's like a
Yeah,
compromise, right?
yeah, that's right.
You got human desire and human the good side and the evil side. So how do you pursue happiness as a group?
Yeah. And that's an interesting kind of point you bring up because, of course, some attention has been given to the Tao Te Ching, and some people have read it as like a political text, right? As having all these political ramifications that the right kind of ruler is the ruler who doesn't rule, right? So the kind of the Wu Wei thing, or the best ruler is the ruler who does nothing, Um, and so I'm intrigued by what that could mean, but whatever kind of form of government that is, I'm not really sure, right? It's hard,
Yeah,
it's hard for me to imagine. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but it's hard for me to imagine. That's for sure.
I think what he was trying to say, my understanding is, you don't tell people what to do.
Right.
You educate people, and they will do the good thing for them. You don't have to actually
Mm-hmm.
tell them what to do. You don't force them by law
Mm-hmm.
or anything. You just set a good example there. Say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to be a good person, the king is a good person. See how he dress,
Yeah.
see how he conduct his life. Everybody just learn from him instead of forcing your value on another person. But yeah, that's not going
Right.
to work in real world for sure.
Right. Maybe, I don't know, but it's still interesting. I mean, I like the way you put that too, for sure. I mean, like I forgot the word, but it's sometimes translate. I forgot the Chinese word, but it's translated into English sometimes is like what is it? Self. I mean, it's really awkward. It's like self-sewing or something like that. But this idea of self-actualization or just self-becoming, and I mean, that's equivalent to just letting the plant grow on its own, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
And I know that's what I mean. That's one of the things I was thinking of based on what you just said, right? About like proper, like a Taoist leader, right? Is going to be the leader that lets things grow, right? According to their own internal, I guess, momentum, right? Or design or whatever, right? So they kind of trust that each one of us will become the kinds of people that we need to be, right? If we're just kind of left to that, right? And certainly there's some evidence of that, right? Do you know what I mean? Like the expression that most people turn out all right, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard that, but I mean, there's some truth to it, right? So there's something kind of nice about that in Taoism too, right? Just let it grow, right? You know what I mean? Let it be what it's going to be. You know what I mean? Because to try and get in the way of that, right? You know what I mean? To try and right, that force, like you were saying, that law, that applying that force, too restrictive, right? Not healthy, I guess.
That's one thing. Yeah. When you go and look for Chinese gardening,
Yeah, right.
the best gardening you can do is it looks like outside with no
Right.
gardening, right? If you
That's awesome.
if you
Yeah.
mow all your grass to be the same height,
Yeah.
think about like a tradition, like a typical American family. Like how much time do you spend on mowing lawn simply just to keep it at a certain height?
Right.
But what about after
Right.
200 years? Like your family don't live here anymore. Eventually the nature takes it back.
Yes.
So you
That's
may
right.
think you change the nature, but for nature, it's just like, oh yeah, I'm here for 5,000 years. For 20 years, there was a disturbance.
Yeah.
After that, I'm back to
Little
this.
blip. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So instead of trying to make everything your way, uniform and forced, why don't you just appreciate the original thing?
Yeah, right. I think that's a
Right.
perfect example, right? With the gardening and this huge emphasis, right, upon gardens and so forth in that culture. That sense of wildness, things being kind of wild, right? And spontaneous. And the grass cutting was a perfect example of that. I don't want to get us off track, but I think you might find this funny. I had an older friend, kind of a mentor of mine. He actually passed away last year, but he lived in Florida, and he lived in Southern Florida, right? And he said, well, if I'm going to live in Southern Florida, I'm going to see what their natural environment's like. I'm interested, right? So he just stopped cutting his grass. He stopped cutting his grass, and he let his grass grow. And he just kind of, became interested in what happened, right? And his neighbors, man, his neighbors just freaked out, right? They couldn't handle it.
For sure.
Right? So there's something interesting psychologically here too, right? That that's the one thing I like about Taoism is it's like, it's kind of like, it's kind of like a test on how much you can take, right? It's like, what's this need to control things, right? Like this need to control things. Including our yards, right? And I cut my grass too, but sometimes it's just absurd, right? It's absurd, right? It's, forced law, control. You will do this, you will do that, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went on a tangent.
People don't even realize what they're fighting for, right? You're fighting against nature. Like, what's the chance of winning that? If we're gone, like a lot of people say, save the planet. We don't need to save the planet. We just save human being, because when human beings are wiped out, the planet is still there. It's just there's no human there, right? So that's interesting. But that also actually part of, I think, explained why, because if you're DAO, you accept everything. It's almost like you become part of that thing. You become something bigger than yourself.
Yes.
But if you're taking control, that's almost like you want everything to become you.
Yes. Well put. I should write that down. That was excellent. That also kind of gets to that Neo-Confucian expression with like CU, like selfish desires, right? Selfish desires is all about me, right? Kind of, organizing the world around me, right? While Tao, right, is very much so about me following the world, right? Do
organize me towards the world instead of organize the world around me.
Yeah. And tell me which one's going to make you happier, right? Because guess what? We both know that there's no way we're going to make the entire world become organized around us, right? It's a tragic belief, right? You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of tragic.
That's basically the effort of Sisyphus, right? You're just constantly trying to stay safe. You prepare for the future. And just think about how much people save for this, like save in the stocks market, save in the saving account and everything. And then suddenly coronavirus, everything got basically screwed up. Like, did you foresee this? Like with all the preparations up to period like this, you start to realize how fragile all your so-called effort really can stand, right? You never test it against the true power. And when the true power comes here, nobody have the capacity to prepare for this.
Yeah. I think that Taoist, I think Asian philosophy, even including Confucianism to a certain degree, but I think the basic kind of Chinese sensibility about like fate, right? You know what I mean? And how things concern like control. I think that could do everybody some good here, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think I know it's helped me, right? Do you know what I mean? Handle these kinds of changes, and there's the other side to this too. And I wanted to ask you a question. Because there's the other side to this too that is also deeply rooted in ancient Chinese ways of thinking. I don't even know if I'd call it philosophy, but kind of philosophy, which is this notion that not only are things changing, not only are we not in control, right? And that we should organize ourselves around the world. But because things are always changing, there's always this way of like fresh possibilities, right? Do you know what I mean? Like new potential, right? Like new beginnings, new opportunities, right? So there's that kind of the opposites again. I don't want to put it in terms of good and bad, but right, with every shift, there's this kind of negative, but there's also this positive.
I would say if you want to think about this and think about it as a pendulum, right? You got yin and yang. Probably we're super rich, super prosper right now, but eventually we're going to become how to say, poor.
Right.
But once we're poor, eventually we're going to become rich again. So that's almost like a pendulum between one way and the other. And I think the reason, I personally think, I can give you an example of my friend who is in Beijing, who lives in
Mm.
Beijing.
Okay.
People in Beijing is really interesting. They can be super poor, but they don't give a damn about the king though. They live right next to the king. They're just like, yeah, there's a new military law came here and claimed them king. Great. My family has since 14 kings. You know, you get your good king,
Right.
you last for 100 years.
Uh-huh.
You're not a good king, you last for 20 years. You know, king comes, king go.
Right.
That's basically that kind of like their philosophy. But you can kind of see, like, since the country has been there for long enough, I think they eventually summarized how things are going to be. That is, you know what, this is bad, but it happened 20 times during the history. And do you know what happened after the 20 times when things went bad in history? Things become better.
Right. That's right. That's exactly.
You know, so
Yeah.
so that's all the philosophies. When we were kids, we constantly have those kind of old sayings. We still do that in school. It's just like, our ancestors said this, our ancestors said that, you know, and there are some wise words.
I think they're very wise words. I've actually thought about that, you know, I mean, especially now that I have a kid, you know, I have a 7-year-old son, and I just think about just general ways of thinking, right? Do you know what I mean? Just, and to me, it's huge anyway, lately, just what a useful way of thinking that is in general, right? You know, it'll save you a lot of heartache, right? You know what I mean? And there's a way of looking at life with more hope that way too, right? You know what I mean? More promise, right? And it totally avoids this something that really makes me angry, right? But that helps us avoid this like idea of this. Everything's just getting better, progressively getting better all the time, right? You know, I mean, I understand what's appealing about that idea, but it's just not really true, right? Do you know what I mean? It's much more complex than that, right? You know, so the yin and the yang, or the cycles, or the right. You know, it's just things are just much more too complex for that. So
If you're overperforming, there is a cost,
that's
and
right.
you think there is no cost simply because you don't recognize they're
Right.
consuming the cost, and you
That's
cannot
right.
last forever. So eventually,
Yeah.
you need to calm down, and you better make it smooth.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
That's right.
Prepare for the worst. Otherwise, when you try to push too hard, and that's when things should be going down, you still push it up. Let's see
Yes.
how hard can you fall, right? So that's
Yeah.
kind of the
Yeah.
mindset there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Another
and that
really
even goes.
interesting thing is I kind of appreciate people here when people study Bible. It's the same thing in China when we study Confucius. The same thing. It's just like there are so many old wisdoms in those kind of ancient books, and they basically exhausted everything about human life.
Yeah.
Almost you feel like, right? Every time once a while I have some struggle in my personal life, and I can always realize, oh, I actually know what to do since I'm 7 years old. It's always in the
Yeah.
book. I
Right.
recite it. I just never realized it's for this.
Yeah. Right.
Right. So even
Yeah.
become a teacher, I always thought about like how to become a better teacher or everything. And then one day I just realized if you open the first page of Confucius' book, 论语, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The first thing they talk about is if you study, but you don't think,
Right.
right? You get confused. And if
Yes.
you think, you don't study, you get haunted.
Yes.
It's already there.
Right.
Why am I struggling
Right.
as a teacher? Like, I just follow
Yeah.
that. You have study, but you also have thinking, and they're not the same thing.
Yes.
And you need
That's right.
both.
That's right. Yes. 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 Very different kinds of skills that need to come together, right? Yeah. No
Yeah.
doubt about it. And then there's whatever the word is, realizing, right? So there's studying, thinking, and then doing it, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Putting that into action, you know, making that real. Oh, the Analects, right? I mean, the sayings of Confucius are Kongzi. I mean, are it's incredible. Like, there's a translation. I mean, there's been several translations of that, but there's a translation by a guy by the name of Ted Slingerland, and he, for each passage in there, he provides copious background kind of information and extensive notes. And so, I mean, I read this a long time ago, but I mean, like, I remember when I was reading through that translation, how useful that was for me. So even something that's 3 or 4 sentences, right? You know what I mean? It's just so much more there. You know what I mean? And when Confucius, you know, when he says 2 or 3 things, like I said, 2 or 3 sentences, he's drawing in all this background information, right? All this background kind of knowledge, right, and tradition, right? That's part of it. So it's such a rich book, you know. I mean, it's just kind of the depth is bottomless, you know. It's amazing. Yeah.
Same thing with the Bible, right? That's why I say, like, when you talk, when you see a kid who was religious and who really read the Bible, and try to understand what the story there, because they're weird stories. Yeah, they're not entertaining stories, right? Yeah, they're not like a Iron Man or a Batman, but
I agree.
Once you understand it, yeah.
I agree, and you know, and you have the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament and that kind of thing too. I mean, like, it's interesting. You should bring the Bible up because I haven't really looked at that strongly in a long time. You know, like, seriously in a long time, and though I have a lot of respect for it. I mean, I went to church when I was a kid, you know, and my dad is not really a believer, but my mom is definitely still a Christian, you know. But where I'm kind of going with this is I have a friend, a very close friend that I've known since I'm about 20. So I'm 47 right now. So I've known him for about 27 years. And he's really been kind of getting back into that, this kind of deep, you know, reading of the Bible, right? You know, it's taking me a long time to get to the point of, like, there's all these stories I'd forgotten about, I guess, is all that I'm trying to say. Even some of the stories that are a little bit less well known, I think, to the average person. And just, you know, it's pretty profound. You know what I mean? It's pretty profound. It's also interesting you should bring this up, and this might not have anything to do with anything you're interested in at all. But
I mean, I'm interested in all this. So it's great.
Well, I mean, you really clearly are. It's a compliment. You're doing this impressive. But like, once I was around 16, I think, maybe, you know, and so I first became very interested in Buddhism, you know, Indian Buddhism, and then that kind of quickly took me into Chinese Chan Buddhism, and then Japanese Zen Buddhism, and then it just, you know, blew up, right? You know what I mean? Then I just got into all of it, right? You know, and then I never turned back. You know what I mean?
It's attractive. It's really attractive idea.
It's attractive, yeah, and I never turned around, you know. So I had kind of like, I had forgotten, like, the rich tradition, right? The rich traditions that are kind of a part of my own culture, right? You know, in that way. And so I have a lot of respect, you know, for deep reading of the Bible. There's a lot of really important truths there, you know. But it's more amusing to me how, you know, once I went that way, I never came back, you know. So, and I mean, I remember too. I mean, I remember just being, like, blown away, you know, by reading about Buddhism and then reading about Taoism. I mean, I couldn't even believe it, you know. So
once you accept it, it become a pattern of thinking. Then you feel everything is natural. You finally have the logic. But the first time you see it, it's kind of weird. Same thing works for me with the first time I see the Bible. Came from China to here and see the Bible. People go to church. I couldn't understand that until I started reading the Bibles and seeing people actually, how to say, explaining the stories in the Bible. I say, wow, you know, if I think of that thing as a book from Confucius, which is basically teaching people how to behave, teaching people how to pursue a better life and everything, it actually does the same thing. Maybe different perspective, but it does the same thing. And one thing I feel kind of sad for young people nowadays is just we focus a lot, I won't say too much, but a lot on science and skills and everything. I almost feel like the deep tradition of human wisdoms we haven't emphasized enough on that for kids.
Oh, for sure. There's no doubt about it. And I'd like
they struggle, right? When they grow up a little bit, they don't know how to actually handle families. They don't know how to handle, like, integrity. They don't know how to handle, like, diligence and all these kind of good values. They kind of feel like, lost. I kind of feel like they're lost.
I think you're absolutely right about that. I think the thing that really, the one bit of the one thing I can contribute to that kind of that idea is that it's this human wisdom thing that you're getting at here, right? Whether it's with these texts like from Confucius, or whether it's the Tao Te Ching or the Zhuangzi or the Bible, right? Or Rumi, right? Rumi is amazing. You know what I mean? The way that they work on us, right? The way that these traditions affect us and influence us is sometimes slow. Sometimes it's hidden. It's, you know, it's not always like apparent, but it's really important, right? Do you know what I mean? So it's and I think that's the part that's the saddest. That's the part that worries me the most. Is sometimes I don't think we can tell how influential these things can be until people are older, right? Do you know what I mean? And so,
Yeah.
I'm really worried about that as well. Yeah.
If you say Bible says this and everybody says that, like the young people won't listen to you at all. Just like, yeah, you were training that way and you're out of fashion and everything. We talk about Taylor Swift, we talk about Marvel, we talk about all those kind of things, which are pretty entertaining.
Yeah.
But the problem here is it can grab your attention really quickly, but it also fade away really quickly. Yeah. And so it's almost like something comes here, and when the tide is gone, you have nothing left.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's still the emptiness you need to constantly fill.
Yeah. Right. You know, as a philosophy instructor, though, you're noticing this too. I mean, like, I think this is probably, I think most of us see this in different ways in our classes, right? Because of the age group that we teach, right? Mm-hmm. How long have you been at UWL for?
I'm here since 2013. Okay. 7 years already.
Okay. Yeah. So I got here in 2009, so we're close enough in that way. One thing that I actually thought this would be kind of neat to do, like some SOTL research, so this, you know, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, like, because right now it's loose. But one thing I'm noticing, I think, in my philosophy classes is that the more intense of a lack there is that you're kind of talking about here, the more that I see them craving it by the time they get to college, right? Yeah. But it's a minority. It's just a few of them, though, right? But it's intense, you know. And it seems to kind of like be, you know, it runs parallel, right? You know. So some of my students in my philosophy classes, I mean, they're just hungry, you know, for something, right? Do you know what I mean? While on the other hand, the sad part of it is in some of our introductory classes is that because they just haven't really ever been given a taste of any of that, right? They just have no interest, right? You know what I mean? So, yeah. Versus somebody who's gone to church their whole life, right? I can usually hook them, right? You know, somehow, right? Because they see the connection. You know what I mean? So anyway, I'm off topic. But I just like
but that's a good point to point out, because it's not like we're just trying to sell old traditional stuff because we're old or traditional minded. Right. It's the good stuff.
Yeah.
Like when a young person who know nothing about this, they sees it, they sense it's a good stuff. Yeah, just like even if you just go back to read Shakespeare's, you know the stories are powerful, even though they're old-fashioned. You don't like the words they use or whatever, but those stories are attractive in a certain way. But it's not like attractive, engaging, and give you like an emotional response right away. But that's something you want to spend more time on and try, and that thing does make your life better.
Oh, it does. It absolutely does.
Right. That's the beauty here. Is just like sometimes you talk with the young kids. You know, there are a lot of material desires, material needs they have, but you got to know, like, number one, eventually they run out.
Yeah, that's right.
Number two is most people won't be able to get it because you're going to have a normal job, regular job, getting regular paid. You're not going to be having like a private jet, for example, which seems like everybody wants.
I know, right.
But there is no limitation how rich your spiritual life can be.
That's right.
It's like the cheapest way to make yourself happy.
Oh, it's amazing.
Right?
Yeah. And it seems to be like that's real happiness, right? Too, you know? And I've even just been taking more seriously. So I've been interacting with some people who are psychologists, about the link between like some meditation and Buddhism and, happiness, right? And that I've been reading these books, and this is an interesting way to put it. And by the way, this concerns Confucianism. It concerns everything we're talking about, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because they were totally tied into all that stuff too. Like taking care of the body through mindfulness and stuff. But anyway,
just to make sure that everything we talk about, since I was trained in Chinese tradition and you were trained in Eastern philosophy, so even though we're not talking about the philosophy, but our opinions is definitely a projection of the philosophy.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is a great conversation. This is so easy, right? I feel like I'm not lifting weights at all, right? Which is good.
So we can talk about anything we talk about, but it's a flow of philosophy there.
Okay. I love it. Perfect. Well, this thing that's interesting that I thought you might find kind of worthwhile is that like mindfulness, right? Meditation, Buddhism, or whatever, like one of the things has to do with like this craving, right? This kind of constant need to satisfy desires, right? And the more we satisfy, the better we get at wanting more, right? The more we want, right? So the very satisfaction of desire just perpetuates more need, right? More want, right? So I'm thinking of like material, like desires, And as it turns out, that's actually not very good for our central nervous system, right? I mean, do you know what I mean? Like they can, so it's also been shown to really not make you, like it doesn't make you happier, right? Do you know what I mean?
Let's think about drugs.
Yeah, right.
Let's think about your desire, like drugs. The first time you take one dosage, and next time you want to get the same quality, you need to have more dosage, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's really tricky how that works too, right? Because you never quite get to that same kind of point,
Yeah.
So the human wisdom traditions that you're referring to, they in helping us deal with that issue of desire, right? And material need, they help put us in touch with something that, like, it really does make us happier. You know what I mean? Like, and you can see it in our brains, and right, you can see it in our bodies, and it's not just me and you trying to like trick people, right? Right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's evidence, and that's one of the reasons. And this is something you would put down on your list of questions, but that's one of the reasons. Like, there's science to prove, right? I mean, like, real quick, there's a guy, a philosopher at a school in Pennsylvania, who's been writing these books on Confucian moral psychology, so Confucian ethical psychology, and its impact on our body, like in terms of our health, like, so very physical, neurological things.
He was pretty healthy, right? He lived all the way to 70, 80 something.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, so very healthy. Yeah, so it's like, it's just better. It's good for us.
Yeah, Confucius himself I remember he was pretty healthy, and he was an athlete too. He's not just like a thinker. He's tall, and he's really good at all the sports.
Right. Very agile, strong, right?
Yeah.
That's really important for you to say that, because this is where I'm almost asking you a question. I mean, like, that sense of activity, you know what I mean? Like, a good life was an active life, right? You know what I mean? And so I think this notion of like just sitting around and thinking, probably, Confucius would say, what are you talking about, right?
Yeah. I think actually the other guy after Confucius, whose name is Mengzi.
Yeah.
He was more specific on this. It's like, what is good?
Yeah.
Are people good? Well, good is something in your heart. You were born with it.
Right.
But a good person is actually you act good.
Yeah.
So your goodness, it's almost like your heart is here, and you have 4 directions, right? You can go. Okay. And everybody leaning towards that, but are you really there? You need to manifest that thing into your action.
Right.
So a really good person is you always do good.
Yeah.
You don't do bad simply because if you do bad, you'll hurt your good.
Right.
So if you practice your good enough, you will find the chi of a good person.
Right.
is in between the sky and the heaven. That's the sky and the earth, the heaven and the
That's
earth.
Oh yeah,
He was
you
saying
will
like you can
fill.
be as good, as good
Yeah,
as the
right,
whole world.
right,
That's what
right,
he was trying to say. That's why he said never do bad, because you're basically wasting all your trainings on good
right.
if you do bad.
And there's a real physical change too, right? I mean, this notion
Yeah,
about chi, right?
yeah.
Which I think is really cool. It gives goodness and badness. It makes them more tangible, right? You
You can
know,
see it from Chinese and Western philosophy therapies
right?
or like medicals. It's just like in Eastern and Western, right? The first time I came here, I feel like people just take pills all the time.
Yeah, yeah,
Just like I'm not feeling good, I take a pill to actually just suppress that, or I take a pill
yes,
to encourage that. But in China, it's always like, don't do that, because you do it for one time, tomorrow it's still there. You suppressed it, then it will come back even stronger. And
yeah.
now what you need to do is just take the pill every day.
Hmm.
Don't do that. Do it slowly. Do it slowly by changing the way you walk, the way you conduct your sleep, the way you conduct your food.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's no way that thing is going to go away right away. But give it a month, 2 months, you find that thing is permanently gone. And you don't
That's
need to
right.
take anything strong to turn that. Instead, you just, it's almost like you're on a car. Don't do a sharp turn, right?
That's right.
Find
That's
a long road, take an okay one, and you can drive really fast and still just turn things back on the right track. So that there is some philosophy there for activities. Yeah.
I love
Another
that.
thing
That's
people don't
perfect.
understand is actually a lot of people compare Kung Fu to
Oh,
MMA,
right, right. Oh,
right?
yeah.
you can see
Oh,
people you can see people doing Kung Fu, and it's not about beating other people.
no, it's not. It's not. Yeah,
It's
it's
about making yourself
totally
a better
different.
person.
Yeah, that's right.
Know your arm, know your finger, know your guts, know your brain, know your shoulder, know everything. And then start to appreciate them, because how many people know how to walk? You may think
Right,
that's easy. How do
right.
you walk in the way that is best for you? How do you actually sleep in the best way? You don't just go
Oh,
to some manual and say 8 hours a day. That's the average,
yeah, that's right.
right?
That's right.
So you
Yeah.
actually start doing something to try to find yourself. It's all internalization, doing Kung Fu.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when you see they start to actually, play Kung Fu or like do Kung Fu, you actually see the severity of them. By the way they conduct Kung Fu, you can see this guy's character.
Yeah.
That's how you show people. That's how you show the nature, who you are.
Right, right. I on that note, I have a good friend, an older. Well, actually, I have a friend. He's a good friend of friends who I'm good friends with, who's older but very interested in my Tai Chi and Kung Fu and things like that, and knows a lot about them. And he also is he gets very irritated when people the same, right? The MMA thing and it's totally different, separate from each other. And he's posted these videos before of like MMA fighters, and then like he'll have like kung fu, contemporary, living kung fu masters. Some of them people who are Western. Actually, there's this California woman who's amazing. But where I'm kind of driving at is that it looks different in so many ways, right? Like its whole expression. You know what I mean? So when you're actually watching them, they're clearly two different kinds of activity, right? Do you know what I mean?
Serve for different
It,
purposes.
different purposes, different kinds of people. I mean, this kind of personal cultivation thing that you're kind of getting at. It's shocking, actually, if you were to kind of watch them, like watch one and watch the other. It's like the first one's like, or it's like Kung Fu is like some kind of poetry, or some, and the other one's just something kind of unfortunate. I don't know, or clumsy to me. I don't know. Aggressive, too much yang, right? I don't know. But anyway, so I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. I made my
Yeah,
day.
that's very interesting, because I talk about this kind of things in my classes too. It's just when you see Kung Fu, you need to
Yeah.
keep in mind Kung Fu is not for martial arts.
Right.
For modern Kung Fu, it's for making yourself feel better. It's almost like
Uh,
an activity you can do and to polish your character. But another thing you need to think about is actually all the moves come from real battle skills.
yeah.
And when you're in the battlefield, you never fight barehanded. So every Kung Fu you see, there is a weapon. They just
Right.
didn't put that weapon there, But just keep in mind, everything you feel like the movie is ridiculous. Actually, they're holding something. They just didn't hold that thing. So that's another way to put it. It's really
That's
effective.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know that. That's really cool. Thanks. It's nice to learn something new like that. That's neat.
Yeah. If you want to talk about that, then later, maybe another episode or maybe in person, I can certainly show you something. For example,
Yeah.
Tai Chi come from the sword art and
Yeah.
Xing Yi come
Right.
from the big spears and everything. Then you suddenly understand why they do things in a weird way, because they're so holding something in their hand and that thing has a shape. That thing has a weight.
Right. So that explains like the position of their arms
Yeah.
and how they're moving and everything.
And
right?
it's also very simple for every move, because to kill people on the battlefield, you don't want to do fancy stuff. Like
Right.
you become tired after you probably just beat 1 or 2 people.
Yeah. So like economy of movement too, right? Is that
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, so that's where Kung Fu come from. It's totally different concept.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
cool. That's really, really interesting. And that kind of the integration. So I think it's like Sun Tzu, right? So like the integration, like the art of war, right? So the integration of the philosophy, military, right? Formation and training. That's one thing I'd like to read more about, especially some of the more kind of classic sources and that kind of thing. Because the Kung Fu, or even like in Japan, what is it? Aikido, right?
Yep. Okay,
Just fascinating, and it's funny, you'll appreciate this too in terms of Tao, that I forgot where, but this one book I read when I was a teenager about Aikido, the guy who wrote the book really wanted to translate that word is to mean something like to bind with affection. I mean, like he wanted to really kind of get down to the roots of what it really meant. And so to bind something with affection. And I don't know if that was just like really like a violent interpretation of that word from Japanese, but it makes sense, right? Because you're using the other person's energy in a way to bind them, right? But without trying to harm them, right? You know what I mean? So
yeah, we're going like in Tai Chi especially, it's just like trying to borrow. It's same as Tao. It's just like, don't use your force. If you want to kill somebody, push him into a river is the easiest way, because the water is going to wash them away.
Yeah.
Right. The best way to beat your enemy is actually let the rock fall on them. You just need to push a little bit at the peak, and the rock just falls. Instead of just carry a rock yourself, run 2 miles to them, and try to throw that thing in the sky high enough in order to actually. Why don't you just stand at the high point from the beginning?
Yeah. Right.
Find the right rock, find the right spot, and just lure them here and just do it. That's all. It's all about using whatever is there instead of just trying to just do things yourself.
Yes, right. I like this idea of borrowing energy. Is that what you said? That's
exactly the Chinese word 借. We talk about 借, so it's exactly the same word of borrowing.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's really rich, because that's really what's happening here, right? And there's something about this notion of borrowing too, that depending on how far you want to take this, it's, we think about borrowing, it's also a way of appreciating, right? Just kind of like a gratefulness or kind of gratitude, I guess for those things.
Same thing with my podcast. Actually, I came up with this idea because I really want to do it. My intention was trying to talk to people, but then I Google online how to do a podcast. I need equipment, I need editing, I need a script and everything, right? So I say, wow, this is a lot of work. I'm not sure if I want to do this. But then back then I was just reading a book about Tao. Then I say, well, wait a second. Let's see who I can borrow. So I say, there must be some place I can borrow the equipment. Who has the equipment? The Communication Study Center. Why don't I just send them an email and say, can I borrow your studio? And turns out they do. They just borrow that thing for free. They have a person to train me on all these kind of things. And then I say, hey, I don't want to do editing. Who can do the editing? Ask around, and then turns out there was a girl who was our department, my colleague's daughter, who wants to be a filmmaker.
Oh.
Who doesn't have a camera? And I have a camera. And I want some people to edit my film. Then that's a perfect match. And then that probably helped her a little bit with her application to her college. But then the thing here is like, I feel like I don't have to do anything. and the podcast is there.
Yeah, right.
Then I started to think about, okay, number one, I use the Tao's idea that is like borrow from other people, right? Don't have to do everything on your own. But the second thing, which is really interesting, that is everybody was happy. It's not like I'm taking advantage of the Communication Study Center because they want their thing to be borrowed.
Right.
It's not like I'm taking advantage of that little girl because she wants to add some film.
Yes.
In this kind of thing, everybody achieves prosperity. Nobody's losing anything. It's not like we have a limited resource, and if I get it, I borrow it, they take harm. And that's the first time actually in my life I actively start to realize I'm actually doing things in a way that Tao appreciates.
Yeah. I was just taken with the way that you kind of put things. I really, 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 really like that. And the fact that you were so easily able to kind of generate an example, right? You know, as a way to tip my hat to you and kind of compliment you, that means it's really kind of like a part of the way you see things, you know. I mean but you know, I'm a philosopher, right? So I have to make a big deal out of what you said too, right? You know, because I can't just like let anything just be, right? Yeah. So look, what's really beautiful about the way you just put that kind of example is it's also a way of kind of getting at like what it means to overcome isolation, to be more connected, right? Do you know what I mean? Which is such an enormously huge part of like Chinese ontology, right? Is this relational thing, right? So when we think we have to control everything all the time, right? And be the ones who are doing everything all the time, right? We don't connect, right? We don't kind of engage with the flow, right? You know what I mean? And so we don't borrow, right? And so then there isn't this kind of give and take, right? And like you were saying, like everybody gains from the interactions, right? It's mutually supporting, right? So if I'm really thinking about qi, I mean, there's like a real exchange here of energy almost, right? You know, it's at some level, right? And so, you know, one of my first serious relationships I was in, so this is a joke, I'm going to make fun of myself for a second, right? But it was a real eye-opening moment in my life. I think I was 25, right? You know, and this was a long time ago. And this person said to me, "You always expect the worst," right? Do you know what I mean? Right? And somebody who always expects the worst, they're not willing to engage in the borrowing relationship, right? You know what I mean? You just have to go for it, you know? And another Chinese expression sometimes has been translated as and it's usually has to do with Buddhism, but like mingle, like mingling, you know, let everything mingle, right? You know, so you're mingling, you know, you're borrowing, right? I just thought that was just a wonderful example. I love it. Some people have a hard time doing what you just did, you know, like psychologically they have a difficult time with it, right? So it's not that they don't understand that their resources are there, right? Is that they have a hard time with those connections. You know what I mean? And so it's through that kind of way of communicating and connecting. I love that. Yeah, that's great.
That's beautiful because like the relationship you were talking about, you don't plan for relationships.
Right.
It's more like dancing. Go there, feel each other's balance and each other's body, each other's pattern.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can dance well.
Yeah.
And if you can really dance, you don't struggle, your partner don't struggle.
Yeah.
You both enjoy.
That's right. That's right.
Right? It's like 2% together is better than either one alone. Instead of saying, hey, I have to give up this in order to be in this relationship.
Right. Well, yeah. And this notion of aloneness too, like I wonder, like for some people, if it's even real. Like, I mean, like, so I think of like Kungza and this notion of Ren, right? So humaneness or benevolence, I guess it's sometimes translated. That there's a retired philosopher from Hawaii by the name of Roger Ames that he thinks that Confucius thinks that we don't even really become people until we engage in mutual borrowing until we mingle, until we
Yep.
really interact with each other,
Yep.
you know? And so this idea of being alone, right? You know, I mean, I'm being kind of, you know, but this idea of being alone, like, I wonder if Confucius would think that that's ever really possible, right? I mean, like in a certain respect, you know, like, so this emphasis on community and family and so forth. Yeah.
It's actually against his will, because
Yeah.
if I need to summarize Confucius in several sentences, the first thing is, when you deal with yourself, you always try to be honest.
Right.
You always try to be real, try to be, you know, don't fake anything, don't try to deceive, don't ever do that. But the second thing, which is very important for Confucius, if you know somebody believing Confucius, here are some features you can look for. Number one, they want to be the good person.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be a good person. They watch what they say, they do good. Okay, even though sometimes it's against their own benefits, but they do it good for the society. They care about the tradition, they care about education. But most importantly, if they can be good, they want everybody around them to be good. They put hope, they put the responsibilities on people. They believe that if you become better, no matter in which kind of way, you should try your best to help everybody around you to achieve that too.
Yes. Right.
That's kind of like a responsibility which is built into Confucius' philosophy, because then you cannot exist alone.
Right.
Otherwise, you lose more than half of what he was trying to say, because more than half of it is about how you make your contribution.
Yes. That took the words right out of my mouth. Right. Yeah, and that kind of contribution is just so important, right? I mean, exactly. Yeah, that's wonderful.
You can, and it's about dignities, right? You live in the world, you want to retain your dignity to be a human being instead of an animal, you know, or some bad person. And you could not have dignity if there's no person around you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're the only person in the world, where is your dignity? Like, what do you even mean by that? You still have your pride?
Yeah, that's right.
With only one person?
Yeah. You're right. It would be impossible, right? I mean, that would be an impossibility for some, yeah. And I think Confucius is true. I mean, I think he's correct about that. There's no doubt about it.
He has a really powerful notion in this, because once people believe in this, you have the best teachers you can hope for.
Yeah. Right.
Because teacher is right in the position. It's just like you become a good person yourself. Otherwise, you know, that's your personal goal. But meanwhile, another part of your personal goal is try to inspire as many people as possible. That is actually your personal goal.
Right.
The benefits of the society is tied to your success. Mm-hmm. So that's his responsibility part, which is quite different from Tao, because Tao will never encourage you to do that.
Yeah, that's yeah. But I'm glad you brought that up, right? Because there's this, I mean, to kind of get down into nitpicking, but there's, as you kind of alluded to earlier, there's something very seductive about Taoism, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's very attractive, you know? But there's these very kind of specific aims, or like these specific goals associated with Confucianism, right?
Yeah.
Really, when you really consider them, right, you see how important they are, right? You see, okay, yeah, that's pretty crucial, right? You know what I mean, in that way. Yeah, it's, you know, at least in the philosophical world anyway, it's interesting, because I kind of, like, I don't have a favorite, right? You know what I mean? I just like it all, but sometimes people get very specific, right? And so it's interesting sometimes to go to these conferences, right? And you see like hardcore like Taoists, right? You know, the hardcore Confucians, and
they fight each other, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's all in good fun, you know what I mean? But it's it gets pretty serious, and a lot of it has to do with the things we've been talking about. You know what I mean? A lot of it does concern that kind of issue. Yeah, right. And then people get into all the cognitive science and contemporary psychology on it, and it gets really tricky, you know, in that way, you know, regarding which theory might be a better, I don't know, life theory, or, you know, moral theory or something.
In terms of biology and psychology.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, yeah, because
you know, when they kind of come into the game, you know what I mean, and so forth, right? You know.
If you think about it, like for example, like the one thing you just talked about before about desires, right? In psychology, they kind of have a theory. You have two kind of rewards you can have. The first one is called consumption reward.
Right.
The second one is called incentive reward. So for consumption reward is more like, yeah, I'm hungry, so give me food,
Right.
I'm happy. You're pretty happy in that way, but you will never be as happy as, for example, like, your favorite baseball team just win. You just jump out and say, yeah, this is great. It's way different from that. So for those kind of things, called the incentive reward. Your brain kind of work in a different way. That is, how to say, you see something is there, and just thinking about the thing is there, and you are making progress towards that thing, give you fun. Once you get it, the fun is gone.
Right.
And you do it in a negative way, it's very easy to see that's fear. And this way is actually hope. So that's why hope is probably a much higher level reward compared to, just appetite.
Oh, sure. No doubt about it. Yeah.
Right. So that's almost like there's something there and you're going towards that.
Right.
Makes you happy.
Yeah, I agree. And this notion of hope, right? I mean, is because that's the word you used, right? Is that hope? Hope? Is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah, I use hope.
Hope. Yeah, I mean that's great. That's a great word choice. Because hope, to be able to hope, right? You know what I mean? It means we have a certain relationship to time. That's unique for humans, I would argue. And that's a very Confucian kind of remark, right? In that sense too. But that was really well put. I think you're right about that. I think that was beautiful, man. I like that.
Yeah. Confucius. I remember there was one time. It's not Confucius, but it's another Tao guy, which is Zhuangzi. And what he was trying to say is just like, if I just say the thing I think today, and after several hundred years, some people pick it up and understood it, I feel like I just meet him and I will become friends, even though we're like 100 years apart, right? So that's how powerful the human wisdom can give you. That is, it actually transcends time. It goes beyond time, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's funny. That's definitely, I mean, and that even ties into hope, right? I mean, like if we think about hope, I mean, this is just kind of broadly philosophical. It's not really, Eastern or Western, but this idea of hope is also being intergenerational, right? I mean, like, just like it might take 200 years, right, for the meaning of something to really kind of occur to somebody, right? The promise of anything might take more time than we can imagine, right? You know what I mean? And so, I mean, like, that actually brings us back to one of the first things we were talking about is that's a really kind of, and I don't know if it's like a tension, but that, it's not necessarily a tension, but that's one thing in Chinese philosophy I like is there's this appreciation of cycles, right? And up and down, right? And balance, but there's also this appreciation of possibility, and I think that does pertain to like hope also, right? You know what I mean? So cycles, it's not like we're just repeating the same thing, right? There's an expression a bit like in music, I forgot I'm not a music theory guy, but there's an expression where you're repeating the same theme but with slight variations, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
So there's this cyclical kind of up and down movement back and forth, but there's also, it's fresh. There's something fresh, right? Like the fresh sense of spring or something like that, kind of like, right? Hope, possibility, and that's definitely a very human thing. No, I did just read this great passage I think you'll appreciate, by Zhu Xi, so the Neo-Confucian thinker, who says, humans can do all this kind of stuff, right? He talks about all the great things humans can do. And he says it's because of the kind of qi we have, right? And he's like, yeah, fish and all these other things, they can't do any of that stuff because they have different qi, right? He's like, but the advantage that animals have is that they do what they're supposed to be doing perfectly, right? And I think that was really beautiful, right? You know what I mean? So thinking of somebody like Confucius, right? Like I can lack virtue, right? I can lack ren, I can not be humane, but a fish, is doing exactly what a fish should be doing, right? A fish is never doing anything wrong, you know. And there was but the passage was really like a way of respecting, right? So kind of getting back to Tao, or the mandate of heaven, right? And all these things that, a deep appreciation, I think, for nature and the kind of perfection that's already there, you know. I mean, so we can hope, but we can also mess a lot of things up.
That's very interesting because human has nature.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
Right.
human probably is the only animal who does not have to behave according to its nature.
That's right. That's right.
Right. So that's actually why we do have a choice. We're leaning towards good, but not everybody is good simply because your action
There's
is
the Mungza. Yeah, right. You brought the
yeah.
Mungza. Right.
It's all about action. Even though your nature is good, doesn't mean that you act in the natural way.
Yeah.
So that's the problem here, and that's according to the fish thing or even animal thing. That's why when you see a wolf killing a rabbit, you don't feel it's cruel. You feel like this is nature. That's energy. That's how they get fed, right, and go on. But when a person to kill in a certain way, right, you can still say, like, for example, like the native Indian people, when they kill their animals, they butcher their food. You still feel like it's kind of sacred, right? It's like, yeah, they're doing that thing for necessity, compared to the way a lot of people do now to abuse a pet.
Yes.
Or the way we produce meat.
Yes.
Or more extreme is like when people abuse people and people kill people. So that's kind of on the wrong track. So I think a lot of thing about the Chinese philosophy is trying to call the nature of you when you were a kid and call that thing out and try to somehow persuade you to act that out.
Yeah.
And if everybody can act it out, it's going to be a great society. That kind of put responsibilities on everybody.
Yeah, I want to kind of talk more about that, because I think that that's really, really important, how you're talking about acting out, right? This kind of expressing, right? Another term you might think about, like something I circulate, put it into circulation, right?
Interactions, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And you do that by engaging other people, right? And engaging the world and so forth, right? I mean, I really like that, because there's like this performative dimension to it, right? You know, and to take that a couple steps further, thinking about like material reality, like qi, right? So when we circulate the nature, right? When we perform, when we act it out, we're changing ourselves, right? Do you know what I mean? That's where it's growing, right? You know what I mean? Or whatever the word might be.
Stronger. It becomes stronger.
Stronger, right? And that's very a real thing, right? You know, and I love that. It's not a metaphor, right? It's like it's real.
Or if you put it in metaphor, it's almost like you have a fish, but that fish just refused to swim.
Yeah,
it's kind of stupid.
Right.
But if you keep swimming and do the cycling you talk about, but it's the same for human. It's just like you become more and more like a fish. But you were born a fish. There's nothing wrong for you to be more and more like a fish.
That's right.
And it will be totally wrong if you don't want to be a fish and refuse to swim, because you're supposed to be swimming. That's right.
Excellent.
All your organs are built for that.
I love it. I'm going to use this in my class, right? So we just so that's the lesson the fish can teach us, right? Right? You know, is we need to figure out our own version of swimming, and we need to do that, right? Do you know what I mean?
It's or let's say this: it's almost a crime, for you to make the full potential of yourself in terms of biology, psychology, whatever, right? It's just like you have all this potential, you got wasted, and you know, a cynical version will say like, I'm good with whatever you are, even though I'm smart. Have you seen the movie The Good Will Hunting?
Yeah. Yes.
Right. I'm good with that, but I just want to, be a janitor. And in China, this is big, because in China, people will think you're wasting your talent. And if you're thinking about individualism, they're going to say, yeah, it's totally fine. It's up to me. I have a talent. I just chose not to use it.
Yeah.
But then you're going to ask you, why are you going against your nature? Do you feel like that's a disturbance? If everybody does the same thing you do, it's Chinese people always say things in this way. It's just like when their kid don't behave themselves, just like if everybody does what you do, think about it. It's going to be a disaster. Please don't be that disaster. Don't initiate it. Don't be part of it. and let's achieve all this harmony. So that kind of put a responsibility on every single person in that society. It's just like you need to behave, and if you don't behave, the whole culture hates you.
Yes.
It's basically that, right? Or at least we don't appreciate you. So that's almost like the mindset, but then you can see how that thing is criticized or against the Western philosophy about freedom and individualism and everything. Just everybody can be whatever they want to be. But what about your potentials?
Yeah.
If you don't push yourself.
Yeah, that's a huge thing too. Let me see if I'm kind of tracking you right. I mean, that's really cool. I like how you put that, because this gets at like a really important distinction in philosophy that sometimes gets ignored, right? So there's this way of talking about nature, right, and potential, and it's being something very real, right? You know what I mean? And this kind of Western sense of individuality, which is like I can just be anything, too, right? Which is, it might be a tragedy, right?
You can't be anything. You cannot breathe underwater for more than an hour.
You can't.
You simply cannot.
Right? Yeah, and there's other things that we can't do either, right? That are not as impressive as not breathing underwater, right? I can think of a number of different things that I really value, that I'm just not that, I don't have any talent. I forgot, there's a word for it. I forgot the word. But it's a way of talking about talent, that kind of just like our differences, you know what I mean? And so I can kind of really work hard, right, to discover what my talents, right, what my potential is, and to really work to actualize that, you know? Or I can just float around trying all these different things because I think I can be anything, right? Do you know what I mean? And so that's one thing I really like about Chinese philosophy, is because it does recognize individuals, right? And individual differences, but it makes it real, right? Like, I'm not you, you're not me, you know, and that's part of what interacting, like that's part of interacting with you. That's part of what makes it interesting, right?
But it's a beautiful diversity, right? That's true diversity. It's just everybody.
That's true diversity. That's right. That's right.
You are an individual, but meanwhile, you also have your social part to play.
That's right.
You cannot just be whatever you want.
Right.
Just basically screw up everybody, and because I want this.
Yeah. And it's ultimately a recipe for sadness anyway, because the fact of the matter is we can't just do anything we want, right? You know, I mean, like we're not born with every possibility in us. Yeah.
That's the thing with Western philosophy, is just like, actually, this kind of thing is in Western philosophy too.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? It's just like the moment you realize you don't have freedom, that's when you are free.
Yeah, right.
Right? But the problem here is, like, nowadays, I think a lot of things just got simplified. It's that everybody's free. Yeah, under a certain kind of precondition, with a certain kind of interpretation.
That's right.
You are free, but don't just take that word and say, hey, I'm free. And use that thing as an excuse or reason or whatever you want to say it, to name it, to just, how to say, justify you, to use that thing to justify your irresponsible action or behavior.
That's right. That's right.
Right? So many people just use I'm free, and this is the free country so easily. They don't think about like the price which comes with freedom, and all the serious thing you need to realize. And that is actually why I think, you know, the education philosophy, no matter which kind, is essential.
Yes.
To even a kid.
Yeah. Right. No doubt about it. To talk about these things, right, and to work through them. Yeah.
And before, like, the Bible and church does most of that, which is great. But then after Nietzsche said, like, God is dead, then the science take over. Now you kind of see, like, it's ready in the mix. It's just like, yeah, we need those kind of things, but usually that was in Bible. It's called religion, but actually it's really about how to behave in the world. But now suddenly that thing is gone.
But I think you're right, like the fact that, and I think this is one of the things you're getting at, and I mean, I love science, there's something, this is a wisdom tradition, right? Do you know what I mean? Its own philosophy and religion, seen together or separately, depending on how we look at them, right? It doesn't matter to me, you know what I mean? Right now, anyway. But they're their own kind of discipline, right? They're their own way of talking and thinking about things. And so, for instance, even though psychologists for, say, the past 20 years have been saying all sorts of like great things about Buddhism and meditation, when you read like a neuroscientific, like when you read a neuroscience essay on meditation, right? Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, but there's so much missing, right? Do you know what I mean? The whole
You lose the richness.
The richness is gone. Yeah, the richness, and so you need all of it, right? You know, you need people saying, look, it shows that neuroscientists are saying Confucius will make you happy, right? But you also just
because of some chemical reaction, right? So
yeah,
it's
right,
kind
exactly,
of like, yeah,
exactly.
it works or it not works. It's more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more exactly. You need all of it, right? You need all of it. You do, in that way. So, but you know, the fact that you're a mathematician, so right, it makes sense because did I already tell you that thing when I saw you about Plato? The sign above Plato's school, that I forgot what the original Greek was, but it's basically translated as, if you don't know math, don't think that you're going to come here and study philosophy. So, so there's always this appreciation, right, for the level of thinking, right? Yeah, that happens. So I thought you would appreciate knowing that. Like, I'm sure that Confucius thought that mathematics is probably more, somebody else should probably worry about that, right? He's too busy dealing with the issues of human desire, you know, and education. But anyway, I can understand your interest. Most mathematicians that I come into contact with are typically philosophical people. And if they're not,
sure, there's no way you can avoid it, right?
yeah,
You all your stuff has to be based on something.
yeah,
You have to have the first self course.
yeah.
And after that, you use logic. With mathematics, you can generate anything. But what's the axioms? What are the axioms?
Right.
How to make those kind of initial assumptions?
That's right.
That's a give me that 5 assumptions. I can generate the whole Euclidean geometry. But where does the 5 assumption come from?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right.
I wanted to tell you this really quick too, and you'll appreciate this. So it's St. John's. I don't know, St. John's University. And so there's one in Annapolis, Maryland, and there's one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and so they're sister institutions or whatever. But they're like classical education. So
Cool.
Every professor teaches across the whole curriculum. So and of course you have different levels of expertise, right? So let's say that you were teaching like Euclid, right? Like, or let's say it was my turn to teach Euclid, like you would be in the room with me as the subject matter expert, but I would be the one leading the class, and you would kind of be filling in and helping me and so forth, right? And but for everything, like ancient Greek, everything. And so there's this core collection of classes. I don't know how many, and everybody is trained to teach. It's the tutor system. So it's like 10 students and 2 instructors or something like that.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
It's beautiful. But I had a friend of mine I went to graduate school with who teaches there. And he was talking about preparing to teach this math class, right? This class on ancient mathematics, you know?
Yeah.
And how, on one hand, it was just hard. He was nervous, but like he was just so excited about it, right? You know, just this.
Yeah.
He's seeing all these connections, you know.
I mean, how do you know that actually? How could you have known that Plato just generated the whole world with mathematics?
Right.
Right. He just defined a sequence, and then suddenly he says, "This is the rule of the mathematics." But then, if you just know the sequence, you have no idea how he came up with this idea, right? With all the God and the external God and the internal world, and then how do we actually borrow forms from the external world and manifest it here? That's why we think the real thing actually exists in the imaginary world. Those kind of things are really great if you teach them together. I don't know if you like. Actually, we can do something similar to UWL. Maybe not a class, but just like a club or something like that with 3 or 4 students even. Yeah. It's just like
I think that actually sounds interesting. Yeah.
It's almost like revisiting all the concepts you have already learned. So we skip the basic.
Right.
But to really try to see the connection, because I mean, I know Descartes because we have vectors, we have Descartes coordinate system.
Right. Yeah, you can't get rid of that. Yeah, you can't get rid of that.
But
That's
you know Descartes
hilarious.
certainly from a different perspective.
Right.
Like Leibniz, who understand that Leibniz actually was a philosopher.
Right.
Leibniz pursues the ultimate truth in everything. Who knows
Yeah.
that? Like I only know
Yeah.
like Leibniz fight with Newton for integral.
You know, my joke about Leibniz is hard, man. You know, I mean, he's even for a philosopher, right? He's I don't know if there's somebody like this in mathematics, but he's just such a genius.
If you count him as a mathematician, then yes.
Yeah, exactly, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Leibniz experts, right? It's like that's all they do, right? That's all the time they have, you know. Like there's just only enough time in the day to just work on Leibniz, you know what I mean? Because they have to sleep and like eat and go to the bathroom and things like that. There's just too much there, you know. There's famous stories, you know, about Leibniz. I mean, like sitting in the same chair for 3 or 4 days, you know, without getting up, other than to go to the bathroom, you know. I mean, just, you know, like he'd nod off, you know, in the chair and wake back up and do more work, you know. So, I mean, I feel like I have good discipline, right? But then there's that, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I for that his level, I won't even call that thing discipline. It's probably just that's all his life is about. So he doesn't probably even need discipline to do that. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that's an important distinction. It was purely, yeah, you're right. It went beyond like even like a choice, right? It just happened.
Yeah.
It was just, it's like the water tap, right? Like you open the water and the water's flowing. It's just like that all the time, you know? I would be happy to do like a club or something like that with you. I think that would be fun. I am and interesting. I'd learn a lot too. And you've probably noticed this too, but at least in philosophy, there's always a certain portion of our majors who are either math majors, you know, they're also math majors, or they're math minors or something like that. So I can easily, like right now, I can think of a student who'd be interested if he's graduating. But like I run across these kids all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, we can talk about that then later for
I actually talked
potentials.
about that. I talked a little bit about that with Chad Vidden at one point, but it never really kind of came together or anything. So.
Yeah, another thing you can think about is actually, I mean, if you want to talk about anything about Eastern philosophy, especially Chinese philosophy, I think I know a little. We can certainly, you know, talk about those kind of things in the club too, because I kind of feel like this kind of conversation is really fun, and it will be fun for some of the students too. It's just you see a person who grew up in those kind of culture who doesn't even feel the philosophy because he feels. I mean, I feels like that's just coming from my family, not even philosophy, until I realized, okay, actually this thing has passed down for so many years. It's not just my family doing that. Everybody's doing that. Yeah, so that will be really interesting.
Yeah, I'd like that too. One thing though, one of the questions that you had was, because I wanted to kind of come back to something we had talked about earlier, but one of the questions you talked about was family, right? You know, and this I know in Confucian philosophy, and so this is where I'd really be interested in hearing some of your responses. You know, like so there's this, you know, everybody knows, right, about Confucius's interest in family, right, and how important that was in terms of moral development. But I think it's heavy, right? Do you know what I mean? Like there's a lot going on there, and it's very, very rich. And I think that a lot gets lost. A lot of the good things about it, right? You know, like and so two things that come to my mind that are really interesting to me is this notion of shared qi too, right? So, like you know the inheritance of ancestral qi, right? Through the birth process, right? So that kind of almost kind of quasi philosophical biological moment, right? But just also this notion that the family dynamic and its emphasis upon relationships, right? And everybody fulfilling their role and flourishing that way. And part of what it means to be humane, at least as far as how I understand Confucius, part of what it means to be humane is from my perspective in the relationship, right? I need to be aware of your perspective too, right? I mean, we need to, and shu, right? Shu, right? Putting myself like SHU. It's been translated as putting yourself into the shoes of the other, which is funny enough.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Empathy is also, and I don't know, and so I don't know what the contemporary Chinese word is for empathy, but the classical Chinese word, and I don't know the character, I'm sorry, but it's shu, has been
Okay.
translated as empathy. Earlier translations have been putting yourself in the shoes of the other, so seeing things from other people's perspective. And I know it's taking me a long time to get to this, but being successful in a family involves understanding the other members' perspective. Am I right about that? Like what they need, like what might be bothering them, you know? So any thoughts? So now I'm interviewing you. So
Yeah.
well, this is more of a conversation, as you said, anyway. But like,
So let's think about things in family, right? You say, hey,
yeah,
I'm a good.
yeah,
So number one in China, as a
right,
kid, being good to your family is the number one important thing.
yeah, yeah,
It's called xiao, right? You have to be super good to your family. But how do you show that? Giving them enough money,
yeah.
doing them whatever they say, doing whatever they want you to do, or is that just right? Well,
Yeah.
Confucius actually told a story like this. That is, like, if you just be good to your dad or family parents, right? You satisfy all their needs, and then you think you're good enough. It's no difference than treating a dog or pet. Just like when they want to eat, you let them eat.
Right.
When they want to walk, you let them walk. So whenever you want to treat them, you want to actually give them your full heart. It's like
Yes.
emotionally, you need to respect them from the bottom of your heart. You will actually behave or polish your actions according to their expectations,
Yeah.
not to embarrass them, make them feel comfortable.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that is actually the right way of doing it, instead of saying, hey, give them material safety, or giving them, like, you know, just fake actions, or just pretend I respect you. No, you need to do it from the bottom of your heart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the key here.
Yeah.
And another thing then will become, how do you do it appropriately? Because sometimes you think this is good for your parents,
Yes.
but it's not good for them. Actually,
Yeah.
then this thing actually applies for everybody, not just to your parents, but also to your friends and everything. It's just like, number one, communicate what each other needs and try to meet those kind of needs.
Right.
Don't
Right.
just say, hey, I sacrifice all this for you, and the other person just say, but I don't need you to satisfy that.
Yes.
You know, you're not helping. You're putting a lot of burden on me because you're doing that.
Yeah. This word appropriate, right? So right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so and that's what you're getting at. Am I right? Like.
Yeah. That's E.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. So you have appropriate relationships. That is like, for example, for E, it's very easy. Be good to people.
Yeah.
But how good you want to be depends on what kind of people you have.
Yes.
And if it's your friends,
Right.
here is where you should be appropriate.
Right.
If it's a stranger, here's what you should do. And if it's your parents, here's what you should. And there are distinctions.
Yeah.
And how do you actually set up those kind of distinctions? You talk with people, you communicate with them, and let them know where their boundary is. Then in this kind of way, you have a clear boundary, I have a clear boundary. Then we can actually make sure that, you know, we're doing things, we're creating this kind of harmony without actually one person think I'm doing this and the other person think you're actually doing something else. And that's where the misunderstanding come from. So that's probably what Confucius was trying to avoid.
Right.
So don't just do general good and be good to anybody. Okay, but find the appropriate way to treat every single person. That, from here you can see, that takes a lot of your mental activity to try to think about what other people need.
That's right.
That's why you value so many different people so much, because you constantly think about, what do they want? Am I hurting them? Am I saying too much? To make a decision, am I actually making the decision to benefit myself, which will hurt their benefits? How are they going to feel about this? So that put a lot of social responsibility on you.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting about that is that plays into a tradition too that has, was also that took hold in China. So as you know, like when Buddhism came to China, it flourished in a lot of different ways, and some of them were more intellectual, right? And they didn't last very long, right? But these practical forms of Buddhism, so like Chan Buddhism. You know, one of the reasons that they did very well was that they were able to incorporate an Indian expression which is called upaya, which means something like skillful, right? And so there's this notion in Zen Buddhism and Chan Buddhism, so Japanese and China, about whether or not what you've said, whether or not what you've done was skillful, right? And that comes close to being appropriate in a certain sense, right? And something is skillful, well, if it works, right? If it brings about more of this harmony, right?
Yeah.
But knowing that, what you need to know in order to act skillfully, right?
That means constantly reflection on yourself.
Reflection. Yes.
Confucius actually does the same thing. He said, like, he has a famous saying, right? When I was 30,
yeah,
I can read something, right? And when I'm 70, I do whatever I want appropriately.
Yes.
That's amazing. That means if you just constantly reflect on yourself, when you are 70, whatever you say, you don't have to think. It's appropriate.
Right. Yeah.
And whatever appropriate, you feel natural. It's just like, yeah, that's exactly what I want to say.
It's like superhuman, right? I mean, like that's perfection. That's as close to perfection as it gets, right?
Same thing with the Buddhism you talk about, because I've seen some monk before, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
You know, the monks, they do a certain kind of like gestures. I don't know, like things like that.
Yes.
You can totally tell an experienced monk.
Yes.
Like the way they stand, the way they hold their, their eyes, their nose, and all their facial expressions and their body. They just stand there, and you feel like it's so polished.
Yeah.
And I can start to think about you as a plant.
Right.
Or like a rock who has been standing there for thousands of years. Like that's how stable, how steady you are, compared to a new monk who like a apprentice. They just like, do things, and you can tell, like, I feel something is wrong. You must be not trained well.
I really appreciate that way of, I like how you kind of picked up on that from talking about this notion of effectiveness, right? Of whether or not something's effective, whether or not it's skillful, right? And whether or not something's appropriate, and how we can witness that behavior. We can see it, right? We can see it in the behavior. There's one more Buddhist thing you might find interesting. This comes from a Japanese thing. So kinsho is sometimes translated, you'll really appreciate, there's a big Western Eastern thing here, I think you'll appreciate. The kinsho is usually translated like as a glimpse of enlightenment. And so people from the West used to think, oh, it's like people have been meditating all day and they have some sort of moment.
No, that's
right, right. Yeah. And so this Japanese Zen teacher said, no. He's like, it's more a way of describing activity, right? And he said, as a way to make his point, he pointed to an older monk who was washing the floors in the monastery, right? And he's like, that's a good way to kinsho that, right? It was like his way of washing the floor. It was completely selfless, right? It was no self. It was perfect, right? Just
be what you're doing.
Yeah, be what you're doing. He was loving that floor, right? Do you know what I mean? Like caring for that floor, right? And so, that really kind of gets at that. That's cool.
I mean, one thing you can think about when monks talk about the old empire, who we think like the sacred king, Shun.
Yeah.
He was talking about Shun, right? Shun was a farmer. And then he described it as Shun farms like he was born to be a farmer.
Yes.
And then he become I don't remember, an officer. And he rule as he was born to be ruled. And then he become the king, or I don't call it king. He become umpire or something like that, leader. And then he lead as he was born to lead.
Oh, right.
That actually helps me a lot, because when I was teaching, this job, sometimes you have ups, you have down, right? Mm-hmm. You wonder, like, how much should I teach? And how much should I actually focus on something else like research and everything? Because there is always a balance of a thing. And I think about, should I go and do consulting work? Should I think about how to, do more research or everything? But then you suddenly feel like, okay, you are a teacher, right? Are you teaching as you are a teacher? You are born to teach, because do what a teacher should do. and you will be happy.
That's right. That's right.
Like
Yeah.
you see so many people is like, hey, who are you? I'm a teacher. Oh, you don't look like a teacher. Like that means something is missing.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes. Well put. I like that very much.
So you can sense the concentration.
That's right.
The concentration of yeah.
That's the word. Yeah. I mean, but that's a good word for it. That kind of concentration, right? Yeah, I like that. And that kind of comes back to something we were talking about earlier about Western and Eastern ways of talking about identity, right? And what it means to become who one is, right? You know, that I very much so appreciate how in Chinese philosophy, what one becomes is something very real, right? Do you know what I mean? Like that's really part of your identity. You know, that's part of your role. You know, in that sense, right? That we're not just kind of floating around, you know, out here, right? Yeah. And you know, just to throw a boring scientific fact into it, it also turns out that at least in the West, they've done a lot of research on this in the past decade. Is that people who are like, let's say, yeah, teachers. Here's a good example. Let's say you're a good teacher, you know, and after 20 years, you like read this book on, I don't know, like model airplane making or something like that, right? And you start to get really into that, right? You know, and you start to like doing that, you know. And the next thing you know, you're like, you know, I'm gonna quit my job as a teacher, and I'm gonna open a business selling model airplanes, right? There's a ton of research that shows that most of those people end up just miserable, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Because they're teachers, and they should continue to teach, right? Do you know what I mean?
I mean, don't get into the wrong
that
idea,
simplified
though, right? Like
things.
you cannot switch your career.
Yeah,
Right? You can certainly switch your career, but what Confucius Monks was trying to say in that thing is, if you are in the position,
yeah,
you have the responsibility, take full responsibility, devote yourself to that thing. But later, it's not your responsibility anymore.
Yes,
you have a different responsibility, devote yourself to that responsibility.
I agree.
With your full heart and full body.
Right.
And that's when people feel like you were born to teach. And then you tell him, I'm not a teacher, actually, you know, and then people, well, what did you do before?
Right. Yeah,
like,
right.
I do every single thing with my full heart, no discriminations.
Yeah.
That's actually where, you know, you get the most happiness. That's where you got the appreciation, right? It's more like the devoting to your role.
Yeah. And Wang Yangming, funny enough, I don't know if that name rings a bell, but
oh yeah, we know him.
Yeah.
Mommy and Juicy, we know all of them. Yep.
I figured you did, man. That makes me so happy. I mean, it's impressive. It's impressive. But you know, really kind of a crazy philosopher, right? I mean, just like really wild ideas, right? You know what I mean? And I love it. I think it's great, you know. But really, philosophically speaking, pretty wild, you know. But he was also a public official, right? You know what I mean? Like he worked for the state, you know. And this captures exactly what you were saying, though, is he was really, really good. Do you know what I mean? He knew that was his responsibility. He knew that was the role that he was given. And he did it really well the entire time, trying to enact these basic Confucian principles, right? Do you know what I mean?
That's really interesting.
I mean, he was dealing with like really difficult things, you know, like flooding and military conflict and like money issues, you know, like economic things. And I knew a little bit about this, but I met this historian. So a historian for Chinese, well, he's a Chinese historian, sorry, a historian of Chinese stuff. But I met him a few years ago, and he wrote a book on Wang Yangming's public life, not on him as a philosopher. He just wrote a book like on what he did, you know, as a public official. And I couldn't even, it was crazy. Like, you know, sometimes I think he was dealing with more difficult issues than many of our current, well, not now. Now is not a good example. But he was dealing with some very difficult matters. Yeah, and so he committed, right?
That's the interesting thing, because
Yeah,
if you think about Plato, right, and he say by the mouth of Socrates is, who should rule? Philosophers,
yeah, right, right,
right? And
right.
can you imagine that actually is working in China?
I know. That's right.
During the ancient China, actually, all the officers, there is one
Right.
book. There's
I
one
know.
thing they all read. That is Confucius book, right? So you read
That's right.
all these kind of things. You become a philosopher before you become an officer,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's so interesting. Actually, the China is doing things in that way,
I
and
know.
apparently it worked.
I and a good way to put it is, even if it didn't reach 100% all the time, right?
Yeah,
50%, I'll take 50%, right? Do you know what I mean? I mean, this gets back to our earlier conversation about what an appropriate education is, right? You know what I mean? And while I don't expect all of our students to become Confucian gentlemen, it would sure be great if they all read Confucius, so that's for sure.
just see a perspective and try to pursue happiness.
That's true. It's true. It's 3 o'clock. I've got to switch gears here.
Okay. Oh, I didn't even realize it's
Yeah,
already
and
two hours.
well, typically, I trust me, this has been one of the best conversations I've had in the past 2 months. So thank you. I really appreciated this. And I know we didn't get to all your different questions, but this was so organic and natural.
We probably finished 2 of them, and I got 13.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Well, I'll take all the blame for that. I'll take all the blame for that. It's I have no self control. It's not very Confucian.
I mean, that's great. That's great. That's exactly the conversation I want. But we can continue another time.
Let's
But I
continue
would just
another
say,
time.
let
Yeah.
me stop the recording right now.
Okay.